The morning sun was just beginning to rise when she stood outside the small diner, taking a deep breath. The neon sign buzzed faintly above her head, and the smell of fresh coffee and sizzling bacon drifted out every time the door opened. It was her first day on the job. And though the world around her looked ordinary, cars rushing past, people hurrying to work, inside her heart was a storm of nerves and hope. Her name was Lana. She was a young black woman who had seen more than most people her age, and the scars on her arms and hands were silent proof of battles she rarely spoke about. Today, though, she wasn't thinking about the past. She was thinking about making a new beginning. After weeks of searching, she had finally been given a chance to work at this diner. It wasn't glamorous, but it was honest work, and she was determined to do it with pride. As she pushed open the door, the familiar sounds of clinking dishes and the murmur of conversation washed over her. The diner was bustling. Already old men with newspapers, mothers with children, construction workers grabbing breakfast before their shifts. The waitress uniforms were simple: a crisp shirt, a black apron, and comfortable shoes. Alana tied her apron tightly, smoothing her shirt as if to armor herself. The manager gave her a quick nod of approval and handed her a small notepad. "You'll do fine," he said, though his eyes flicked to her arms briefly before looking away. She noticed, but she didn't react. She had grown used to those glances. People always looked, some with curiosity, some with pity, some with cruelty. Today, she reminded herself she would focus on the work, not the whispers. Alana moved through the tables carefully, balancing trays of coffee and plates of eggs, smiling politely at each customer. Her voice was soft but steady as she asked, "Can I get you anything else? Or would you like a refill?" On the surface, everything seemed fine, but she could feel the weight of eyes on her. The scars on her arms peeked out from her sleeves when she reached across a table, and the marks on her hands were impossible to hide as she held plates at one booth. Two young men snickered quietly, elbowing each other and whispering words she couldn't quite hear. At another table, an older woman's gaze lingered too long on her arms before she quickly looked away. Alana kept her head high, forcing her smile to stay in place. She had promised herself she wouldn't let anyone ruin this chance. She needed this job. But more than that, she needed to prove to herself that she could start over. Still, every smile she forced felt heavier than the last. Every time she noticed someone staring, she felt the sting of memory, the surgeries, the pain, the nights she had looked at her own reflection and wondered if people would ever see her as more than her scars. But here she was, standing, working, moving forward. That alone was something to be proud of. She tried to distract herself by focusing on the details of her work. The smell of butter melting on pancakes, the hiss of bacon frying on the grill, the laughter of children spilling orange juice on the counter. These small, ordinary things reminded her that life kept moving no matter what. She belonged here, just as much as anyone else. Yet, beneath her calm surface, a nervous question lingered. Would people ever accept her as she was? She had walked into this diner hoping for a fresh start, but fresh starts were never easy. Sometimes they began with resistance, with judgment, with the cold stares of strangers who thought they knew her story just by looking at her skin. But Alana knew something the others didn't. She knew that scars didn't mean weakness. They meant survival. Every mark on her arms carried a story of endurance, of nights when she wanted to give up, but didn't. Those scars were her past. Yes, but they were also proof of her strength. And while the customers in the diner didn't know that yet, she carried the truth silently with her as she placed another cup of coffee on the table and wiped her hands on her apron. In the corner, unnoticed for now, sat an older man with calm eyes and a quiet presence. He wore a simple jacket, his posture straight, his hands steady as he sipped his coffee. Unlike the others, his gaze wasn't curious or cruel. It was watchful, thoughtful. He hadn't spoken yet, but he saw more than the others did. He saw the way Alana moved, the way she endured the stares without flinching. Something about her reminded him of people he had known long ago. For Alana, though this was only the beginning of her shift. The clatter of plates, the murmur of voices, the occasional bursts of laughter blended into the background as she focused on one thing: keep going. Every step, every smile, every order she took was one more step into her new life. She didn't know what the day would bring. She didn't know that by the end of it, her scars would no longer be a source of shame, but of honor. For now, she carried the weight of her past quietly, her heart pounding, but her spirit steady. It was her first day, and though the world saw only her scars, she knew this was the start of something more. A new beginning. The first hour of Alana's shift went smoothly enough. She focused on her tasks, refilling coffee, delivering plates, jotting down orders with her neat handwriting. She kept her smile ready, even when her chest tightened from the occasional stares. She told herself, just get through the day. Let's keep moving. But as the morning crowd shifted, the diner filled with a different energy. A group of 4 sat in the corner booth, loud from the moment they walked in. They were regulars, young men who always seemed to believe the diner was their stage. They laughed too loudly, spoke too crudely, and treated the staff like props in their performances. Today, unfortunately, Alana became their target. She approached their table with her notepad in hand, her voice calm. "Good morning. What can I get for you today?" One of them smirked, his eyes dropping to her arms. The scars peeked out from under her sleeves as she held the pen. He nudged his friend and whispered something that made them both chuckle. Another leaned back in his seat and said loudly enough for nearby tables to hear, "Guess someone's been through the wars, huh?" The table erupted in laughter. Alana froze for a second, her pen hovering over the page. She knew what they meant. She had heard it before, jokes about her scars, cruel questions asked with fake curiosity. She tightened her grip on the notepad, forcing her voice to stay steady. "Would you like to order?" They didn't stop. Another one added, "Careful with the hot plates, sweetheart. Looks like you've already burned yourself enough times." The laughter was sharper now, cutting through the air. A few customers turned to look, their faces flickering with discomfort, but no one spoke up. The sound of their laughter carried across the diner, louder than the clink of dishes or the hiss of the grill. Alana's face stayed calm, but inside her chest, a storm was building. Every cruel word felt like a weight pressing harder on her shoulders. She wanted to disappear, to melt into the floor and escape the spotlight they had thrown on her. But she also knew one thing: she needed this job. She could not let them break. She wrote down their orders quickly, her handwriting tight from the pressure in her hand. As she turned to leave, one of the men leaned forward, his voice dripping with mock sympathy. "Don't worry, darling. Scars tell stories, right? Bet yours aren't pretty ones." Alana walked away without a word, but her silence didn't mean weakness. It was a choice. She placed their order in the kitchen, her hand steady, even as her heart raced. In her mind, she repeated the same phrase she had carried with her. "Years, they don't know me. They don't know what I've survived." In the back, 2 coworkers had heard the exchange. One shook her head, muttering, "Poor girl. She's gonna have a tough time here." The other, less kind, whispered, honestly, "It's hard not to stare. I'd cover them up if I were her." Their words stung almost as much as the men's laughter. Still, Alana pushed forward. She brought out plates to other tables, her smile steady, though her chest ached with the effort. The whispers and laughter felt like knives, but she refused to let her hands shake as she set down plates and poured coffee. The group at the booth wasn't finished. When she returned with their food, one of them pointed at her arms again and said, "You sure you can carry those? Don't want you to drop them and add another scar to the collection?" The others laughed, slapping the table in amusement. The sound was cruel, but beneath it, something shifted. Not everyone was laughing. To a nearby table, an older man in a simple jacket put down his fork. His eyes narrowed slightly as he watched the scene unfold. Unlike the others, his gaze wasn't mocking. It was sharp, observant, like someone who had seen enough of life to recognize cruelty for what it was. Alana caught his gaze for a fleeting second as she placed the plates on the booth's table. There was no pity in his eyes, only understanding. It startled her, but before she could process it, the young men's voices rose again. "Thanks, sweetheart," one said with exaggerated cheer. "You're tough, huh? Tough little waitress, with tough little scars." Alana straightened her back, looking directly at him. She didn't speak, but the firmness in her eyes was enough to silence him for a brief moment. Then she walked away, her steps measured, her chin high. The laughter continued behind her, but something inside her shifted too. She was used to this mockery, whispers, cruel jokes. She had faced it before, and she would face it again. But she also knew that scars were more than marks of pain. They were marks of survival. And one day, someone would see them for what they truly were. At that moment, she didn't know that someone already had. The veteran in the corner stirred his coffee slowly, his eyes fixed on the tattoo half hidden beneath her sleeve. He had noticed it when she leaned across the table, a simple design most people would dismiss. But to him, it wasn't simple at all. To him, it was unmistakable. And soon, the cruel laughter in the diner would be silenced not by Alana's words, but by the truth her scars carried. A truth only he recognized. The swing doors to the kitchen swung shut behind Alana with a thud, muffling the cruel laughter from the dining area. For a moment, she allowed herself to breathe. The sharp sting of humiliation was still fresh in her chest, but she forced her shoulders back and straightened her apron. The kitchen was no safe haven. It had its own kind of noise, its own kind of judgment. Steam hissed from the grill, pans clattered, and cooks shouted orders over the roar of the exhaust fans. The air smelled of frying oil, bacon, and freshly baked bread. Alana squeezed past a dishwasher with a tray of plates. Pretending not to notice the way two waitresses near the coffee machine leaned toward each other, whispering. She heard her name. Then, like a knife slipping between her ribs, she caught one of their comments. She should cover them up. It's distracting. The other giggled, lowering her voice just enough to think she couldn't be heard. I mean, scars that deep. What did she even do? It looks like she's been through a war or something. The words stung more than she wanted to admit. She kept her face calm, pretending she hadn't heard. But inside, her thoughts spiraled. Why do people always think scars need explaining? Why do they think they're allowed to decide what I should? Hyde, one of the line cooks, a young man with tattoos running up his arms, glanced at her as she picked up an order. His look wasn't cruel, but it wasn't kind, either. It was curious, probing. He didn't ask anything, but his raised brow said enough. She could almost hear the unspoken question. What happened to you? Alana balanced the plates on her tray, her movements careful and professional. She had learned long ago that silence was her best defense. Words could be twisted. Explanations could be mocked. But silence, at least, kept her dignity intact. Still, the whispers didn't stop as she returned to the pass-through window to collect another order. One of the waitresses muttered, "I don't know how long she'll last here. The customers won't get used to it." Alana's fingers tightened on the edge of the counter. For a brief moment, she wanted to scream, to shout that her scars were not their business, that every line on her skin carried a story of pain and strength, but she swallowed the words. She couldn't afford to lose control, not here, not now. Instead, she focused on the rhythm of her work. Table for needed coffee refills. Table 7's order was almost ready. The group in the corner booth, still laughed loudly, their voices carrying into the kitchen every time the door swung open. She pushed it all down: the laughter, the whispers, the stares, and concentrated on the task at hand. But she couldn't push everything down. When she bent to grab extra napkins from the lower shelf, her reflection caught in the shiny steel of the oven door. For just a second, she stared at the jagged lines across her forearms, visible under the harsh kitchen lights. She remembered nights in the hospital, the sting of bandages, the way doctors had said she was lucky to be alive. She remembered the long months of recovery, the quiet tears, the determination that one day she would walk into the world again, with her head held high. And yet, here she was, being mocked by strangers and whispered about by coworkers, as if her survival was something shameful. The veteran in the corner booth hadn't left her mind. She had noticed him watching quietly while the others laughed. He hadn't looked at her scars with disgust or pity, just recognition. There had been something in his eyes she couldn't place, something steady and familiar. She didn't know why that look stayed with her, but it did. Back in the kitchen, another waitress brushed past her and whispered, "Ignore them. They'll get bored eventually." But Alana knew better. People didn't get bored of cruelty. They got comfortable with it. And the more comfortable they became, the harder it was to stop them. She carried another tray out into the dining room, her face composed, her steps steady. The laughter from the corner booth stabbed at her ears again, and she felt the sting of tears pressing at the back of her eyes. But she refused to let them fall. Tears would give the mockers exactly what they wanted. In the kitchen, the whispers might continue. In the dining area, the mockery might grow louder. But Alana reminded herself of one truth as she placed a plate gently in front of a customer. Scars were not weakness. They were proof she had survived battles that most of these people couldn't even imagine. End soon, though she didn't yet know it. Someone in that diner was about to remind everyone else of that truth too. Someone who had seen scars before. Someone who understood what they really meant. The diner buzzed with its usual rhythm, forks clinking against plates, the hiss of bacon on the grill, the murmur of conversations rising and falling like background music. But amid the noise and laughter, one man sat quietly in the corner booth, his coffee untouched, his eyes steady. He was older, his hair peppered with gray, his posture straight as if years of discipline had carved it into him. His jacket was plain, the kind many veterans wore, with a small American flag pin glinting faintly under the fluorescent lights. He had come for a simple meal and a quiet morning, but the moment Alana walked past his table, he knew there was more to her than the tray she carried or the polite smile she offered. While others laughed at her scars, he did not. He had seen scars before, on friends, on comrades, on himself. To him, they weren't marks of shame. They were the language of survival, etched deep into the skin. Each one telling a story that only those who had lived it could truly understand. When a group of young men jeered at Alana, his jaw tightened. Their laughter was loud, cruel, and sharp, but he didn't join in. Instead, he watched her carefully, the way she held her shoulders, refusing to slump under their cruelty. The way her hands never trembled, even as they carried the weight of their mockery along with heavy plates. The way her silence wasn't weakness, but control. He had been in rooms like this before, though not in diners. Mess halls overseas, crowded tents during deployment, gatherings where someone always became the target. He remembered the look in people's eyes when others laughed at them. He remembered how those moments could cut deeper than any wound. And now, watching Alana, he felt the same heaviness stir in his chest. For a while, he said nothing. Veterans knew the power of waiting, of observing before acting. He sipped his coffee slowly, listening, watching, thinking. His sharp eyes caught everything: the young men's smirks, the waitress's whispers in the kitchen doorway, the way Alana pressed her lips together to hold back her emotions. She reminded him of soldiers he had once known, those who carried pain quietly but carried it with pride. Then it happened. As Alana leaned forward to place a plate on a customer's table, the cuff of her sleeve slid up slightly. It was only for a second, but it was enough. His eyes caught the ink on her skin. A small, faded tattoo, simple to the untrained eye, but to him it was unmistakable. A unit insignia. His breath caught. He leaned forward, squinting to be sure. Yes, there it was, clear as day, the mark of service. He had seen it hundreds of times, worn proudly by brothers and sisters in arms. Some carried it on their shoulders, others on their chest. Some even etched it into their skin after coming home, as a reminder of what they had lived through together. Now here it was, on the arm of the young waitress who was being mocked for her scars. The veteran's mind raced back through time. Dusty roads in foreign countries, the weight of gear on his shoulders, the sound of helicopters slicing through the air. He remembered nights around campfires where soldiers spoke in quiet. Voices about home and family, about what they'd left behind and what they hoped to return to. He remembered the looks in their eyes, tired, heavy, but proud. And he remembered the scars, so many scars, worn openly because hiding them was impossible. Looking at Alana, he no longer saw just a waitress. He saw someone who had walked the same path, someone who had served. Someone who had earned her scars in ways these laughing boys could never imagine. His respect for her grew instantly, silently and deeply. The anger he felt at the mocking voices burned hotter now, but he kept his composure. He had learned long ago that respect is not shouted. It is shown. Alana passed by his booth again, her eyes meeting his for just a moment. She saw something. In his gaze, something different from the others. Not pity, not curiosity. Recognition. She almost faltered, caught off guard by the weight of it. But then she moved on, balancing her tray. The veteran's hand tightened around his coffee cup. He had come here for breakfast, but fate had placed him in this room for something far more important. He could see that Alana didn't need saving. She was strong enough to endure, but she deserved recognition. She deserved for the truth to be spoken out loud, so he waited. He waited for the right moment, his eyes never leaving her. The laughter at the corner booth rang out again, sharp and cruel, but soon it would be silenced. Not by anger, not by force, but by respect. Respect that had been earned through sacrifice, carried in scars, and marked forever by the ink of a unit insignia. The veteran knew what he had to do, and in just a few moments, so would everyone else. The diner bustled with noise. But for the veteran in the corner booth, everything slowed the moment he saw it. The tattoo, small design, half hidden beneath Alana's sleeve, revealed only when she leaned forward to set down a plate. To most people, it would have been nothing, a bit of ink, a decoration no different from the dozens of tattoos people wore. But to him, it was unmistakable. A unit insignia. He knew it well. He had seen it in far-off lands, worn proudly by soldiers who fought beside him. He had seen it stamped on patches, painted on vehicles, carved into the memory of long days and longer nights. To him, that mark wasn't decoration. It was a story. It was survival. Alana didn't notice his stare. She carried herself as she always did, quiet, professional, enduring the jeers from the corner booth like she'd endured so much else. But the veteran leaned forward, his coffee cooling in front of him, his heart heavy with the weight of recognition. He couldn't believe it at first. This young waitress, mocked for the scars on her arms, had once stood in uniform, part of something greater than herself. He remembered the way she had walked past him earlier, her chin held high, even under the weight of cruel laughter. He remembered the way she had ignored the whispers and carried her trays without complaint. Now, with the insignia in plain view, It all made sense. Her silence wasn't weakness. Her scars weren't shame. They were the mark of service, of sacrifice, of battles fought beyond these diner walls. As she passed again, balancing drinks on her tray, he called softly, "Miss." Alana turned, her polite smile in place. "Yes, sir. Can I get you something?" Else his eyes flicked briefly to her arm, then back to her face. "That tattoo?" he said gently, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "Which unit?" Her breath caught. For a moment, she froze, unsure how to respond. No one ever asked about it. Most people didn't recognize it, and those who did rarely cared. Her instinct was to brush it off, to hide it as she always did, but something in his gaze stopped her. It wasn't curiosity. It was recognition. Respect. Her voice was soft, almost hesitant. "The 58th Support Battalion," she said. The veteran's chest tightened. He nodded slowly, his eyes glistening. "I thought so." His voice carried a weight that only another soldier could understand. "I served alongside some of your people, good men and women." Alana's lips parted slightly, for the first time. That day, her smile wasn't forced. It was small, fragile, but real. The veteran leaned back, his eyes never leaving hers. Louder now, so that the tables around him could hear. He said, "Ladies and gentlemen, this young woman you're mocking. Those scars you laugh at, they were earned." She wore the uniform, she served. The diner fell into silence. Forks stopped clinking, conversations died mid-sentence. Even the young men in the corner booth quieted, their laughter cut off abruptly. All eyes turned to Alana. Her heart pounded as heat rushed to her cheeks. She wanted to shrink, to disappear. But the veteran's voice was steady and strong, carrying authority no one dared to challenge. "She didn't get those scars from mistakes or clumsiness," he continued, his eyes sweeping the room. "She got them protecting this country, protecting people like you. That tattoo?" He pointed gently toward her sleeve. "That's a mark of honor. It's a bond that can't be erased." Whispers spread through the diner, but they were no longer cruel. They were shocked, hushed, ashamed. The same people who had stared at her with judgment now stared with wide eyes, their expressions shifting from arrogance to guilt. The young men in the corner shifted uncomfortably. One opened his mouth as if to speak, but no words came out. The laughter that had filled the room earlier now hung like a bad memory, sour and hollow. Alana stood frozen, her tray balanced in her hands. She hadn't asked for this moment, hadn't expected it, but a strange warmth filled her chest. For so long she had hidden, letting others define her by the marks on her skin. Now, in just a few sentences, the truth had been spoken out loud. The veteran stood slowly, his chair scraping against the floor. He straightened his jacket, then raised his hand in a sharp, respectful salute. His voice softened but carried clearly through the silence. "Thank you for your service." Alana's throat tightened. Tears pricked her eyes, but she blinked them back, standing a little taller. She didn't return the salute. She didn't need to. The weight of his words, and the respect in his gesture, was enough. Around the diner, heads bowed slightly. A few customers clapped quietly, hesitant at first, then stronger as others joined in. It wasn't applause for a performance. It was applause for truth, for recognition, for honor that had gone unnoticed for too long. Angela lowered her tray slowly, her eyes shimmering. For the first time since stepping into the diner that morning, she didn't feel small. She didn't feel invisible. She felt seen, not as a waitress, not as a woman mocked for her scars, but as a veteran. As someone who had given more than most could understand. The laughter that had once filled the room was gone. In its place was respect. *4. A few seconds, Alana stood rooted to the spot, her tray balanced in her hands as if she had forgotten how to move. The veteran's salute still hung in the air like a heavy silence, wrapping the room in a sense of gravity no one could ignore. The clinking of forks and the hiss from the kitchen seemed to fade away. All that remained was the sound of her own heartbeat and the murmur of shocked whispers rising among the customers. She lowered her tray gently onto the counter, her eyes darting nervously around the room. Everyone was looking at her. The same people who had laughed at her scars just minutes earlier were now staring with wide eyes. Not mockery, but something else: guilt, respect, even curiosity. Alana's throat tightened. For so long she had kept her past locked away. She had hidden her scars under long sleeves when she could, avoided conversations that might reveal more than she wanted. To her, silence was safety. But now, with the truth already out, there was nowhere left to hide. The veteran gave her a small nod, a gesture that was both gentle and firm, as if he was silently saying, "It's all right. They need to hear it." She drew in a slow breath. Her voice, when it came, was soft but steady. "Yes," she said, her eyes sweeping the room. "I served." The whispering died down immediately. "I was in the army," she continued, her words simple, her tone free of drama. "I deployed overseas." Those scars. She glanced at her arms briefly, the marks that had drawn so much ridicule. "They're not from clumsiness. They're from combat, from serving my country." A hush fell over the diner. Even the young men in the corner booth shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their smirks gone. One of them looked down at his plate, unable to meet her eyes. Alana swallowed, her chest heavy with both fear and relief. "I never tell people," she admitted, "'cause most don't want to hear it. They see the marks and they make up their own stories. But I didn't ask for pity. I didn't ask for shame. These scars are my history. They're a part of me." The veteran, still standing, broke the silence with his deep, steady voice. "She's telling you the truth. I know that Insignia served with men and women from her unit. I've seen what they've faced. You don't mock scars like those, you honor them." A murmur rippled through the crowd, but this time it wasn't cruel. It was thoughtful, humbled. A woman near the counter dabbed her eyes with a napkin. A construction worker at another table nodded slowly, his gaze full of respect. Even the waitresses who had whispered in the kitchen earlier now looked down. Ashamed of their careless words, the young men in the booth were the most shaken. The one who had laughed the loudest earlier cleared his throat awkwardly, muttering something under his breath. Another shifted in his seat, his face pale. They had thought they were making harmless jokes. They hadn't realized they were ridiculing someone who had risked her life for people just like them. Alana took another breath, steadier this time. "I came here to work, to start over. Not to be mocked, not to be stared at like I'm broken. I'm not broken." She lifted her chin, her eyes clear now, strong. "I survived." Her words landed like stones in still water, sending ripples of emotion through every person in the room. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable, it was reverent. People looked at her differently now, not as a waitress carrying trays, but as a woman who had carried far heavier burdens before. The veteran gave her another small nod of approval. "You've done more than survive," he said. "You've served. That alone deserves respect." Slowly, almost hesitantly, a few customers began to clap. It wasn't loud at first, just a soft acknowledgement. Then more hands joined in, stronger and more confident, until the entire diner was filled with applause, not the mocking sound of laughter, but genuine appreciation. Alana's cheeks burned, her eyes shimmering, but she stood tall. She hadn't planned to reveal her truth that day, but now that it was out, she didn't regret it. For the first time, she felt the weight lift off her shoulders. Her scars no longer felt like a secret to hide. They felt like a badge of honor. The applause faded into quiet again, but the mood in the room had changed completely. The people who had whispered cruelly now whispered apologies. The ones who had stared with judgment now looked at her with admiration. The young men in the corner remained silent, their arrogance deflated. The veteran sat back down, finally sipping his coffee, but his eyes stayed on Alana with a warmth that spoke volumes. She gave him a small nod of gratitude, an unspoken thank you that needed no words. The truth was out, and with it, everything had changed. For several long seconds, the diner stayed in silence after Alana spoke her truth. The air felt heavy, almost sacred, as if everyone in the room understood they had just witnessed something bigger than an ordinary day. The clatter of dishes, the sizzling of the grill, the faint hum of the neon sign, the everyday sounds of the diner seemed to fade into the background. All eyes were fixed on her. The waitress who had been mocked for her scars, now standing, taller than anyone else in the room. The faces that had once smirked at her now looked changed. Some were pale with embarrassment, others flushed with shame. A woman near the counter clutched her handbag tightly, her eyes glistening with tears as she whispered to herself, "I didn't know." A man in a suit, who earlier had turned away, when the young men laughed, now leaned forward as if trying to offer silent respect. Even the children, usually noisy and restless, sat quietly. Sensing the weight of what had just unfolded, the veteran remained on his feet, his hand still resting on the table, his eyes steady. His voice had been the one to uncover the truth, but it was Alana's strength that had silenced the room. He knew that. He could see it in the way she stood now, shoulders back, chin raised, not as a woman embarrassed by scars, but as a survivor proud of them. The group of young men in the corner, who had laughed the loudest, were visibly shaken. Their arrogance had drained away. One tapped his fingers nervously on the table. Another stared down at his half-eaten meal. The boldest of them, the one who had joked about her scars being ugly, opened his mouth to say something, but the words never came. Instead, he muttered, "I'm sorry," though his voice was so low only those nearest to him could hear. But the veteran heard, and so did Alana. She didn't respond to the apology. She didn't need to. Sometimes silence carried more power than words ever could. Then, slowly, the applause began again. A single pair of hands clapping, then another, and soon the diner filled with the sound of respect. This wasn't polite or forced, it was heartfelt. People were clapping not for entertainment, but for recognition, for courage, for survival. The noise swelled, bouncing off the walls and filling the air with something far stronger than mockery. Admiration. Alana's cheeks warmed, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. She wasn't used to being seen this way. For so long, her scars had drawn whispers, pity, or ridicule. Rarely respect, rarely honor. And now, in the very place where she had been mocked, she stood as the focus of it all. The veteran placed his hand over his heart, a small but powerful gesture that carried the weight of every soldier who had ever worn the uniform. Alana felt her throat tighten at the sight. She gave him a small nod, her lips trembling into a faint but genuine smile. The atmosphere of the diner had shifted completely. Where there had been cruelty, there was now reverence. Where there had been laughter, there was now silence filled with thought. And where there had been judgment, there was now respect. Alana's co-workers, who had whispered about her scars in the kitchen earlier, avoided her eyes now. One of them bit her lip, guilt etched across her face. Another murmured, "I didn't." No. As if those words excused the things she had said. Alana didn't hold their gaze. She didn't need their validation anymore. She had carried herself through worse than whispers. The customers who had been silent, witnesses earlier, shifted uncomfortably in their seats. They had watched her humiliation, without stepping in, afraid of drawing attention to themselves. They were realizing their silence had made them complicit. That realization sat heavy in the air, but it also turned into something else in awakening. They had underestimated her, judged her, dismissed her. Now they saw her as she truly was. Someone stronger than all of them. The veteran finally broke the moment with a calm, steady voice. "Respect isn't given to the loudest voice in the room," he said, his eyes sweeping the crowd. "It's earned through sacrifice, and she's earned it." His words landed like truth carved in stone. Heads nodded slowly, some solemnly, some with regret. Alana inhaled deeply, her chest lifting as though a weight had finally been removed. For years, she had carried her scars like secrets, but now they had been revealed not as weaknesses, but as proof of survival. She looked around the diner and saw not pity, but respect, shock mixed with admiration. And though she hadn't asked for it, though she hadn't wanted the spotlight, she realized something in that moment. She no longer had to hide. Respect had finally found her.